You see the title of this meeting, the title I've chosen for this meeting, there on top. And then you see 7 quotations that I've taken from related writings. Writings related to our topic. I would like to begin with a kind of introduction, and I would like to place these quotations in context. I will not say too much about each quotation. I will say just a few words to make you more familiar with the context out of which these quotations have been drawn. But before that, let me ask you, are you familiar with Martha Nussbaum's political works? But you're familiar with Martha Nussbaum as a leading American philosopher. You're also very familiar, I'm sure, with her idea of political emotions. Isn't that true? I mean, it's part of your readings. This idea of political emotions is part of that of your readings. So I suppose there is some basic familiarity with Nussbaum as a philosopher, right? Please feel comfortable and free to ask me any questions on the way. Please interrupt me. In any case, I'll try to be brief so as not to make you tired with too much information. So let me begin with the fact that political education concerns a very broad range of citizenship issues. I heard from Paul that this morning you did some work on citizenship and citizenship education. And I know that these seminars, these day-long seminars that you're having with Paul, deal with issues of gender, race, and animal rights, and animal issues more generally, animal ethics, for instance. So here, all of us together can work on something different, another aspect of citizenship education, one that concerns membership in a nation state, membership in a political society, membership in a political community that has very specific distributions of power. Okay? A political community which deals with political matters, with issues of legality, law, issues of recognition of the role of several groups within that political community, and so on and so forth. So, my interest now, during the seminar, is on a political community, or in other words, a political configuration that represents the rights of people and could be considered a state. Are you familiar with the characteristics of a state? What makes a political community a state, an independent state? Do you know fairly, roughly, what makes a state, what makes a community, a political community, a state?
Probably.
Shall we try out?
Sure.
What do you think?
Well, one is political institution.
Institutions, yes.
Process.
Mm-hmm.
And population. Well, I don't know. Well, some people say it's multiple.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you may have multiple ethnic communities, or you may have a rather homogeneous population. Well, currently, as the world situation is at the moment, what we have are mostly multicultural states. though this is not always reflected in the organization of the state, of course. It's not always translated into parliamentary power, for instance, or parliamentary participation. But true, you need to have a people in order to have a state. True? Very true. Also, you need to have a territory. Okay? And in that case, we talk about territorial sovereignty. When people are in a specific territory, have control of that territory and consider the political issues of that territory their own business, in a way. And they have to deal with all that, with everyday life, with, as I said, distributions of power within the territorial limits of the state. Okay? Also, the notion of sovereignty is very deeply associated with the state for another reason, because it determines the rights of that political collectivity in such a way that no other political collectivity can intervene in that collectivity, in the first collectivity. So, a political community as a state is a demarcated community of clear boundaries in natural and symbolic terms. When I say natural, I mean with some physical borders sometimes, or some artificial borders, but also at the symbolic level, there is a clear-cut demarcation of what belongs to this state and what is outside. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that this raises all sorts of issues about gatekeeping and entry points, and who is allowed to join a state or become a citizen of the state, and so on and so forth. Who has citizenship rights, who is granted citizenship rights, and so on and so forth. Right, so now a question is, can a state, a political configuration, a political community, inspire people, political emotions? Or is it just something that we find ourselves in and we just cope with it, fulfilling our duties, we pay our taxes, we have responsibilities to it, but at the same time we have benefits from it? So is that all that there is to it? Or could there be any emotions involved, political emotions, directed at the state or related to the state? Do people feel attached to their state? Obviously, sometimes a state is a nation state, and that complicates things even more. In other cases, we have a multinational state, right? Which is another complex situation, either as a homogeneous nation state or as a multi-ethnic state. Any state is a major player in people's lives. Okay? So, since it is a major player in people's lives, could it be that the state inspires feelings to people? Political emotions, such as anger, for instance. That's a very common thing, isn't it? Or feelings of appreciation, maybe. Some other affinities with it, a sense of belonging. Typically, states are intergenerational communities, or another term for it is cross-generational communities, which means that they are not of this particular moment, but they go a long way back in history. Okay? That means that the political emotions involved here date back, and they are passed on to the new generations through what we call acculturation. You become, acculturation. You become immersed in a culture. You are constructed by a culture. Okay? So through various cultural processes, we become members of a political community. So I would like to begin this contextualization of the selected quotations with a passage from Kanako Ide. Ide's article concerns the debate on patriotism and nationalism in Japan. And what I have extracted reads as follows. One of the major reasons why the debate in Japan has been conducted in the same terms for so long is that it has never been discussed in terms of the conception of patriotism, and only one concept has been employed by both those who favor and those who do not favor patriotic education. One that equates patriotism with obedience, authority, and nationalism. So that's the first quotation I've selected. You see here that the claim is that the whole debate revolves around a standard concept which is shared by both sides of the debate. And according to the author of this quotation, this means that no new efforts are made to redefine patriotism. So, if patriotism has to do and involves our political emotions related to a state or to a nation, if that's correct, then we must explore what kind of emotions are involved in this patriotic feeling for a nation or a state, or a nation state. According to Ide, at least in the Japanese context, but I'm sure you're in a better position to tell me if that's correct. So according to Ide, the idea of patriotism that is currently debated in Japan involves obedience, authority, and nationalism. So it seems that patriotism is defined through such terms. Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, would patriotism be love for one's country in such plain terms, just love for one's country? If patriotism also involves obedience, authority, and nationalism, could a love for country be as simple as that? Just, I belong to a place, I just love it. Or could it be a bit more complicated and intricate? So that's one of the possible questions that we may explore together. So there is a plea for reconceptualization, for conceptualizing patriotism in a different way. There's a plea on the part of Ide to think of other conceptions of patriotism, and explore other such conceptions that perhaps take us a little bit further beyond the debate as it currently evolves. Now, Nussbaum does precisely this. She tries to promote another conception of patriotism. In the past, Nussbaum's philosophy was associated with cosmopolitanism. You know the term? You're familiar with the term cosmopolitanism? So Nussbaum was a leading figure in the philosophy of cosmopolitanism. But after a while, especially gradually after 2001, from then onwards, she shifted toward patriotism. And she now claims, probably you have seen this in the book Political Emotions, but more broadly, she has published several texts in which it becomes obvious that she has turned toward what she terms globally sensitive patriotism. Now, how do you feel? Would that be a patriotism related to obedience, authority, and nationalism? Highly unlikely. Why? You wouldn't expect from Nussbaum this, would you? You know, to have a notion of patriotism that would be about obedience, nationalism, and authority. What do you think? Would you like to talk about this at all? Shall I rephrase the question a little bit to make it a bit clearer, what I'm asking? What I'm asking is, you're already familiar a bit with Martha Nussbaum's work and her book on political emotions, okay? Now, we've seen in the quotation from Kanako Ide that most of the time patriotism is defined through obedience or associated with obedience, authority, and nationalism. Would you imagine that this could be the notion that Nussbaum uses as well? Is it a bit unlikely? I think it is a bit unlikely, isn't it? Okay, so probably, and now I'm trying to see whether you would guess like that, probably Nussbaum has a different conception of patriotism. One that could not easily be identified with nationalism, certainly not with obedience and authority, pure and simple. So it must be another kind of patriotism. Wouldn't it be a notion of patriotism involving also some positive political emotions? Most possibly. Correct? Okay. Before we see or before we talk about how Nussbaum understands patriotism nowadays, let us see what was her opinion in the past, when she was more dedicated to the idea of cosmopolitanism and promoted the idea of cosmopolitanism. So the second quotation comes from a famous article, newspaper article, that Nussbaum wrote back in 1994. The title of that article was Patriotism and Cosmopolitanism. That's a famous article, and very many people still refer to it. So there Nussbaum defended cosmopolitanism and argued that cosmopolitanism should be the ideal to cultivate in schools in America and elsewhere. One of her opponents, the people she criticized in that article, in that newspaper article, was another philosopher, another famous American philosopher, Richard Rorty. Okay? Now, Richard Rorty, a postmodern philosopher of great influence, an eminent philosopher in the US, as you will see now, was in favor of patriotism. So, Rorty supported patriotism, Nussbaum supported cosmopolitanism, and Nussbaum explained why she differed from Rorty. Here is the relevant quotation. In a by now well-known op-ed piece in the New York Times, 13th February 1994, philosopher Richard Rorty urges Americans, especially the American left, not to disdain patriotism as a value, and indeed to give central importance to the emotion of national pride and a sense of shared national identity. Rorty argues that we cannot even criticize ourselves well unless we also rejoice in our American identity and define ourselves fundamentally in terms of that identity. Right. Before I go on, would you like to take a minute to read this passage yourselves as well and think about it? Okay, take a minute to think about it and then let us talk about this passage. Is this passage clear? Are there anything, any words, terms, whatever that you would like me to explain? What is this passage saying? What do you think? What do you make out of it?
There is one common identity that's somehow everyone's bought into that.
Mm-hmm.
It's only through knowing yourself that you can be critical of yourself. But what I don't understand is why the only way to know oneself is in reference to some kind of national allegiance. Obviously that's a big part of your identity, but I don't think it's the sum total of who you are. It's not how you feel about your country. I don't think that's the only thing that's...
Perhaps Rorty should answer this. And he did answer it a little bit further down. So many thanks for posing this question, because it will be very helpful to see how it is answered. We will see it a little bit later, how it is answered. But for the moment, about the community that you mentioned, it is said here that as a community, the Americans are urged by this philosopher, Rorty, to feel stronger patriotic feelings than they usually feel. They usually do. Does Nussbaum agree with that or not? What do you get from the tone of this passage? Does Nussbaum agree with Rorty or not?
But if she's cosmopolitan, then no.
At that time, yes. She was a cosmopolitan at that time. Very well put. At that and a very good way of guessing. At that time, yes. You see, the date of this publication, of this extract, is 1994. It was the date of the publication of the article, the Boston Review article, Patriotism and Cosmopolitanism, where, as explained, she argued in favor of cosmopolitanism. So probably she's not very comfortable with what Rorty does. Any other indications in this passage? Can you trace any indications? Yeah.
And in this passage, there is a sentence that Rorty argues that we cannot even criticize ourselves. The emphasis on even seems to me that she's criticizing him and showing another way to criticize ourselves in different ways.
Okay, yes. That we cannot even criticize ourselves well unless we also rejoice in our American identity and define ourselves fundamentally in terms of that identity. So a way to contextualize, many thanks for this, yeah, and also the word rejoice, huh? It's in quotation marks. And this gives you the impression that she takes some distances from this. You know, she doesn't feel so enthusiastic herself about the, rejoicing of, the rejoicing in the identity. So a way to contextualize this passage is to consider the fact that it comes from a text which is in favor of cosmopolitanism. And that gives us an idea that what is said about Rorty is not really a positive comment. Okay, she takes distances from that. We will explain later more about this. But I think there's another striking point there that has to do with the tendencies within the West more broadly and in the American context more specifically. What's the tendency in such context as regards patriotism? Can you figure out from the passage? If you read it again, you may be able to figure out what is the tendency to which Rorty objects. What is the tendency toward patriotism nowadays?
It's right wing. Is that? I don't know if that's where you're going, but
No, read it again. The tendency seems to be to, at least the tendency in the left, okay? When it comes to the American left, the tendency is to disdain patriotism, okay? So there is this tendency which is not just of the left, although it is definitely more often encountered in the global left, but it is often equally a right-wing tendency to discard patriotism, especially when you have right-wing internationalism, also, which is also a branch of more broadly a political stance to issues of right and left and the future of the world and all that, where it should head on. So, the tendency then in the US, especially in leftist academia, is to discard patriotism. So, it is precisely those people, the left-wing people, that Rorty addresses. And he addresses with this plea to reconsider their position, because Rorty believes, we figure out from here, that the emotion of national pride has a political importance. Okay? So he sees value in being patriotic, because he likes the idea of national pride and believes that some positive political effects may come from feeling proud about your country. That's Rorty's position, okay? Right. The third quotation comes from the same text, from the same newspaper article. Again, I mean the early work of Nussbaum on such issues. And would you like to read it? Would anybody like to read it to all of us?
The emphasis on the patriotic pride is both morally dangerous and ultimately subversive of some of the worthy goals patriotism sets out to serve. For example, the goal of the national unity in devotion to worthy moral ideals of justice and equality. These goals, I shall argue, would be better served by an idea that is in any case more adequate to our situation in the contemporary world, namely the very old idea of the cosmopolitan, the person whose primary allegiance is to the community of human beings in the entire world.
Thank you. Would you like to work cooperatively on this quotation? I mean, instead of me providing another contextualization, would you rather work a little bit more collaboratively on that, and along the following questions, just to help out, to facilitate your discussion? Think, for instance, about Nussbaum's position on national pride or patriotic pride. I use the terms patriotic and national here interchangeably, as Nussbaum does. So please think, and please consider what's Nussbaum's position on national pride here? How does this relate to Rorty? What I'm trying to help you see is how all these issues emerge as topics of debates, philosophical debates, how philosophers place themselves in opposition as regards these topics. So please consider Nussbaum's position on national pride, and also how she connects patriotism with cosmopolitanism. Does she connect them in a way that they would be equally necessary? Does she connect them in a way where possibly one suffices as a political ideal and the other is expendable? We don't need it. And if yes, which one is unnecessary? So, would you like to have a couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes or 4, to do this? That's great, thanks.
English, maybe, I think, with camera.
Right. Shall we? May I ask you to share your ideas with us? And if there are any questions, shall we begin with the questions? Any questions or remarks first?
It's just my private perception. Doesn't need to be too anything. But I found these concepts a bit too abstract in terms of considering the history of the United States, which means if you talk about national identity, we have, for example, the people who are living there, the indigenous that have been killed, and they were being formed mainly by immigrants, and immigrants that came from Europe, and the ones that were brought up from Africa, from trade and slavery, and other immigrants as well. So you have a power relationship already happening there. And in terms of national identity, the country is really big, massive, and well populated. How would you create a national identity, considering these different voices in which they had equal strength in terms of reinforcing their identities in that context? So I just missed this a bit.
Anybody would want to respond to that? Shall I then? Shall I?
Can I just?
Yep.
I mean, I 100% agree with what you were saying, and I was having the same thoughts. And I think, I mean, as far as 1994 goes with Nussbaum, I mean, it wasn't even just national unity, but she was a cosmopolitan. So she had this whole idea of, allegiance to the entire human race. So it's even beyond America that we have this kind of idea of a shared commonality, or I mean, I wouldn't say identity, but there's something that we should
Feel free to say identity, because ultimately, Nussbaum talks about a cosmopolitan identity, which is the outer circle of what surrounds us. There is the self, and there are circles. The circle, the narrow circle of the family, then the circle of the professional group in which we belong and shapes our professional identity. There is also an outer circle which concerns, say, the religious beliefs of a person, the religious identity. Then there is a broader, have I mentioned the country? That's another circle. A broader circle, in the case of European people, is Europe, and so on and so forth. And the outer circle is the cosmopolitan circle, which defines our cosmopolitan identity, our belonging in the human race, as you said, our belonging to humanity, and our being defined by what Nussbaum used to see at that time as the common characteristics, the common features that we have due to being human beings.
But just, I mean, even just to be in a position to make a claim like that, there is such a huge sort of area of power. I mean, there's a power in being able to do that, and I think power relations is really key to this. And if you are a subjugated member of society, or a subjugated group of people, you don't have the power to make the kind of claims that she's making. And made me quite angry, to be honest. But I don't know. Yeah.
Do you think that the assumption that we all belong to humanity, we all belong, to the human race, and we have some obligations to all the people in the world that derive from the fact that we are all human beings. Do you think that this assumption is necessarily at odds with the claims of a minority or with the claims of an oppressed population?
I
Is it
think
by
some of us
definition at all?
have
At all?
more responsibility than others.
True, very true.
I don't think there's an equal level of responsibility.
I
so
agree very much on that, sure.
But maybe somebody else wants to.
No, it's no problem. No problem. We have still that question there. Was it a question, an objection? I think it was at the same time an objection not just to Nussbaum but also to Roti, I gather. Well, it is true that there has been a debate in the United States about the possibility of a national identity along the lines that you have described, that both of you have described. I mean, what about the issue of power relations? What about the position of minorities? What about the history that affected that nation to which allegiance is expected by the people, by all the citizens of the country? So there has been a huge debate there. Are you familiar with the term politics of identity? It's a political term, it's a term of political philosophy that signifies the claim that separate groups, minorities, have a claim. They raise political claims. They want to be respected. They want to be recognized, respected. They want the past to be acknowledged. They have expectations on other groups of people to acknowledge that those other groups may have higher responsibilities and also liabilities, historical liabilities. On top of that, philosophers or other thinkers, supporters of identity politics, emphasize that some small groups or minorities run risks within a broader culture. They run risks of being marginalized. So many people, many thinkers associated with identity politics raised important objections to the very idea of a common national identity, thinking that this puts in danger smaller groups, becoming marginalized and sometimes even of losing their identity. Hence the term identity politics. So the politics forwarded by those thinkers in the name of minorities and small groups and in the name of history, of course, the history you've just, the narrative that you've just placed together in few words very pertinently, of destruction, of exploitation, of Europeans going there and, setting another lifestyle and worldview in course on the continent's ground. All that has been recruited by identity politics scholars to help them argue that it might be even politically damaging to think in terms of a national identity as if everything is shared in common so lightly, so unaware of history and previous political relations, power relations. Perhaps you would like to search a little bit more on such issues, and in that case there's also another trend. There has been another trend in the US. It's called politics of difference. Are you familiar at all with the term politics of difference? Now, it relates to some extent with identity politics, but scholars associated with the politics of difference take a somewhat different line of thought. They are not so protective of minority cultures as the identity politics thinkers are, but they emphasize the fact that we are different, people are different, groups are different, communities are different, and that any kind of effort to place everybody together and coordinate, regulate their actions as if those differences were not operative would involve a kind of violence, ultimately would involve a kind of violence. So one thinker you might search and find more about this position is a feminist philosopher, Iris Marion Young. So she is associated with the politics of difference, and in the 90s she produced very important work in the direction of exploring and deploying arguments such as those that you have already raised yourselves. It's because I see a convergence in the questions yet and remarks that you've made, the two of you, isn't it?
It's because of Nietzsche.
So yes, Iris Marion Young was very aware of the problem that you have mentioned. How do you form a national identity in such a context? And perhaps that context is not unique to the US, it's more generally a context that we encounter in very many other settings. If you want to look up the idea of identity politics, another important source would be Charles Taylor, who was a communitarian thinker. Now, already you have seen how a debate has been formed in the US. On the one hand, you have the supporters of identity politics who object to the idea of a common national culture or common national identity. On the other hand, you have the politics of difference, the supporters of the idea that, again, a common national identity may be an abstraction, just as you said, and a rather convenient abstraction that obscures issues of differences. Now, another line of thought that you encounter in such debates, a third possibility there, associated again with other scholars, is that which says, it's a position that says, yes, fair enough, history has been like that, but now we are a country, we are a state, a specific state which is a global player and undertakes several projects, has great influence in the world. So if we do not coordinate our efforts, if we do not feel that we have something in common, we share things, and we have a common responsibility for that kind of intervention of our country in the world. So if we do not find a common thread there, something to unite us, something that unites us, then will we be able to deal with our global role, for instance? Will we be able to deal more critically with the past of our own country and with its present, not just its past? So Rorty is one of those scholars, Richard Rorty. In one of his books with the title Achieving Our Country, 1998, Rorty argued precisely this, that yes, we have a common history, which was a history of many bloody episodes, of course, and many injustices, but it was a history also of some principles. So it wasn't just, a uniform situation that can be presented lightheartedly in a uniform narrative, in a homogenizing narrative. It was something very rich, which began, for sure, through acts of violence that should never be obscured. But from then on, it developed, the whole course in history developed in such a way that produced a certain country, a country which is there and is operative. And we should have some responsibility about all those operations of that country and be engaged in debates about what is now happening or what is done by this country. So there is a third line of thought which claims that, yes, the past is there, we should not forget it, but a better way of dealing with it and of dealing with current politics is to create a culture of common responsibility. Responsibility may vary. It may be common, but it could at the same time vary. Sharing some responsibilities in common doesn't necessarily mean that the share of responsibility is equal. But at least there is a responsibility that all people, more or less, and to that extent or to this or that extent, should have. So there is this other line of thought, the third one, if I were to number them. The fourth line of thought in the American context is that represented by Nussbaum of those times. And it's a line of thought that subscribes neither to identity politics, nor to the politics of difference, nor to the politics of national cohesion, but it's a position that concerns a cosmopolitan direction of the country. So this is why I believe it merits to be treated as a fourth option, a fourth choice in that debate. So Nussbaum argued, more or less, that we can treat cultures within the state better, but we should also treat other people outside the US better. We should know other people too. We should learn about other people. We shouldn't only learn about the debates or frictions or tensions within our own culture, within the American context, she meant, but we should also see what is happening in the rest of the world. So in that article, Patriotism and Cosmopolitanism, Nussbaum went as far as suggesting a cosmopolitan education that should have priority over a patriotic education or an identity politics education or a politics of difference education. Okay? So you see, the whole thing is complex. The claim you've just made about the history and the acknowledgement of history could be accommodated by some of those participants in the debate. Possibly by all of them, more or less, but in a different way. They make out something different of it. All of them make out something different from it. Right? Now, anything else about this quotation in terms of questions or remarks, initial remarks before we discuss it? Is there anything that comes up as a question, something that makes you curious about? Are you curious about something there?
I had a question about this, her line that says the very old ideal of cosmopolitan. So I wondered if you could there must have been debate around whether this is actually an old term, whether it's a culturally specific ideal that came out of the French Revolution, but underpinning cosmopolitanism, is it always the sense that it's very old?
Very good question. Very, very good question. It feels new, doesn't it? The term. the whole approach, it feels like a kind of theoretical projection, a projection into theory of what we experience as globalization, or what we experience as the fact that, for instance, now we are all of us together at this moment. I come from a different background, and each of you comes from a different background. Isn't that it? Well, the truth is that it is an ancient Greek idea. It is as old as that, because the term cosmopolitanism derives from a school of philosophy, an ancient Greek school of philosophy known as the Cynics, Diogenes. Have you come across this name? 5th century BC. When Diogenes, ancient Greek philosopher, as I said, was asked where he comes from, he answered, "I'm a citizen of the world. I am cosmopolitis, citizen of the world." And from then on, other ancient Greek philosophical trends followed up that line of thought, especially the Stoics, the Stoic philosophers. Now, Nussbaum has retrieved all that tradition. In fact, later Stoics of the Roman period developed the idea of belonging to the world, of being a citizen of the world, and gave it also a normative aspect. When I say normative, you understand, they made it a must, so to speak, that we should care about others. We should care about the whole world. We shouldn't feel, in a restricted sense, members of a specific community, but we should feel that we belong to a larger community, which is none other than the whole world, the whole of humanity. So Nussbaum retrieved all that tradition and combined it also with post-French Revolution thinking, philosophical thinking after the French Revolution. She combined it with Kantian themes of cosmopolitanism, and this is how she came up with her own version of cosmopolitanism. So yes, there is a historical line of thought, there is a whole conceptual history of the term cosmopolitanism that is very much operative underneath Nussbaum's text. So many thanks for this question, because it's very helpful for clarifying the whole context. Thanks, yeah.
In the previous part of discussion, we talked about citizenship being a kind of an elitistic product. And I'm wondering whether the same applies for cosmopolitanism. Because it might be an old or an ancient ideal, but I have the feeling that Diogenes was part of the elite. I mean, we are talking about a time when we talk about democracy, something we admire from ancient Greece, but we had slaves and there were different castes and women didn't enjoy rights. Of course, we should contextualize and not compare today's democracy to democracy of yesterday. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that for me, the idea of cosmopolitanism has, like citizenship, it feels a bit elitistic. Also, something else related to that, I'm a bit concerned when people, I'm not doing citizenship, I'm doing history education, but they are very much related. So when people suggest that we should start from cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism, I'm a bit worried in the sense that especially younger children learn empirically. So I'm thinking, shouldn't they learn rights and responsibilities first from their own communities, or at the same time within their own communities and in relation to others? But I'm afraid that in our effort to in our effort to move away from patriotism, we are being too optimistic and too romantic. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
You're making very, very clear sense and very helpful questions. Yeah, thanks for this. Would you like to respond to any of that? These are very important points. So would you like to respond to any of that? Do you also feel that there's a risk in cosmopolitanism, a risk of romanticizing, first of all, the construction of the self, assuming that we are detached from space and time? Sometimes, yes, we have the feeling when we talk about cosmopolitanism and explore the ideals of cosmopolitanism. Yes, sometimes don't we feel that it's more or less like we are detached, we just belong to the human community, but other than that there isn't anything significant really in all the rest of our lives? A lot of significant stuff is there in our lives, things that we encounter in everyday lives and in localities, in small contexts. Precisely because we are constructed beings, okay? Precisely because of this. From very early in our lives, we find ourselves within tensions, difficult situations, all the givens of a real life within a specific context. In other words, we are situated beings. So, okay, it's one thing to feel a member of the whole humanity, but it's quite another to consider issues that relate to your upbringing, you're coming from a specific culture, the fact that even the act of teaching and learning always begins from home, we would say, in every sense of the word. You know, from the home, literally, from very, very early, from the earliest stage of our lives, but also from home in the symbolic sense of what is, you know, from what is local and available there to us in the very first place as a spatio-temporal determination of our lives. So yes, that's a very important objection to cosmopolitanism. And it is true that cosmopolitanism often seems, or cosmopolitan thinkers who claim to be cosmopolitan anyway, seem detached from problems that concern specific localities, which is a bit ironic because cosmopolitans should be very sensitive to injustices occurring in small places, for instance, or everywhere, anyway, everywhere in the world. Okay? So it's a bit contradictory and ironic. On the one hand, you have cosmopolitans claiming that they care about the whole world, and on the other hand, you see them quite often to ignore the context, to ignore the specific political problems, for instance, of small communities or of small countries, which are involved in all sorts of power relations with the bigger global players. So I started with the last bit of your question, which had to do with education and the fact that even when we educate children, we start with experience from a locality. So yes, there have been criticisms directed at cosmopolitanism like that, and I would strongly encourage you to search into that kind of material. True. Now, on the objection about elitism and Diogenes, two things there. Can I write there? I mean, has Paul used that? Mm-hmm. There's an article by Catherine Liu. It was published in, if I'm not wrong, 2000. The title is The Many Faces of Cosmopolitanism. And there, Catherine Liu discusses the charge of elitism. The accusation that cosmopolitanism is elitist. She discusses this thing. There she argues that there are many arguments why cosmopolitanism need not be elitist, though it is sometimes. It is elitist because sometimes cosmopolitanism is associated with the scholar, the global scholar, the mobile elites, those people who travel all over the world. So there are such dangers of elitism, and related charges have been directed at cosmopolitans. You know, that they are a sort of a global elite, they are celebrities, you know, even academic celebrities who go about and promote their own agendas or their own set of values, and so on and so forth. So there is this charge. Now, my answer to this charge would be that if we avoid this tendency that unfortunately is very much there in cosmopolitanism, to abstract from context, so if we manage to do this, and if we avoid to specify the cosmopolitan as the mobile figure or the scholar or any exclusive figure, then we may end up with a more sanitized cosmopolitanism, one that could break with the elitism that is associated with the philosophical trend of cosmopolitanism, and also with the typical figures of cosmopolitanism. So that's the short answer I can give. The long answer would be, you know, a reformulation of cosmopolitanism. And that's something that many of us have tried to do. In that case, I think the best way to such a reconceptualization, reformulation of cosmopolitanism, in my view at least, would be to combine it with well-meant patriotism. A revised patriotism and a revised cosmopolitanism could make common cause in ways that would keep afar all the dangers that have so far been associated with both trends, with both political ideals, the cosmopolitan and the patriotic. But of course, you understand that even we have to be reflective here, because even the very hope and promise of sanitizing ideals, political ideals, should be a cautious one, because no matter how much you try to sanitize ideals, there are always dangers there. So you shouldn't be too optimistic or too confident that you can produce something which is politically perfect or on the way to perfection. Now, the final point about Diogenes. Diogenes was the least elitist of all. So I'm saying this for reasons of historical accuracy, in the sense that Diogenes was such an unconventional philosophical figure. He was born in a place in Pontos, Sinope, and I'm mentioning this only because he was kicked out from there. He was expelled from the city because he was so oppositional to everything they were doing. He left that place. He went to Athens to do philosophy, but there too he was very unconventional, and he was challenging the Athenian democracy all the time. Unfortunately, we don't have much of what he had written. Had we had some material like that, we would have been able to see whether he challenged any established institutions such as slavery and so on and so forth. So at this moment, we cannot make any such claims. We know, of course, that some people with whom he associated, like some sophists in ancient Athens, challenged the institution of slavery. Unfortunately, this is not known throughout the world. So the Athenian democracy was, the Athenian society was a rich world as such, which had its own negation. It had its own forces of criticism. It's very true that doesn't change the fact that they were a slave-owning society, and also that they were oppressing women and all that. But we must bear in mind that there was also opposition to that, quite early, and philosophy, instead of being construed as an absolutely elitist enterprise, contributed a lot to that challenge. Some ancient philosophers even challenged the expansionism of the Athenians. So we have the earliest criticisms of something like colonialism, for instance. We have them in ancient Greek philosophy. So it's a complicated thing. What I'm trying to say is that you don't have just a uniform narrative here again. You cannot have just a uniform narrative. And definitely, of all philosophers of the ancient Greek world, Diogenes was most probably one of the most unconventional figures who challenged really deeply his society. Very deeply his society. Even his own way of living was too far from being elitist. You know, he was living in a jar, in a big jar, like a dog's house. Oh, another thing that you might want to search a little bit into is, you know, the story of the history of cosmopolitanism, of course, and the stories, all sorts of stories and anecdotal episodes related to Diogenes. Right. So thanks very much for this question. Sorry, I went a bit, on and on about, to explain things, but so let me know how do you feel about this passage, the third one? First of all, you have discussed it together. Would you like to share with us more or less the main points of that discussion you had as a group? Who would like to take over? No? We can move on. We can move on if you don't feel so comfortable with that. Don't worry at all. We are free to explore our ways of organizing this. And we can do that collaboratively. You will tell me how you feel about the whole process. So, would it be easier if I ask you some questions just to facilitate the discussion and, direct a bit the discussion? For instance, is it clear whether Nussbaum is appreciative of patriotic pride here or not? Do you have a clear position there? Is it a clear position? Have you made out what Nussbaum believes on the issue of national pride or patriotic pride? Does she favor it in this passage?
I think our group was in consensus that she was against it.
Yes, what?
Yeah.
That she's against it.
Yeah.
Yeah. She finds it politically dangerous, morally dangerous. Mm-hmm.
She does see some use in it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But aren't those aspects better served by something different? And what's that? Yeah, and what's the alternative that she promotes? Yes, cosmopolitanism. In that early work, Patriotism and Cosmopolitanism, the Boston Review article, 1994, Nussbaum believes that patriotism is at best expendable, at worst a dangerous ideal. So at best it is just there and could be replaced because cosmopolitanism can do the same things more or less, can cover the same moral ground and at a global level. But at worst, patriotism may end up being a dangerous ideal. Now, what's the danger of patriotism? How do you feel about that? Is patriotism dangerous in your view? What do you think? Or what are the possible dangers of patriotism?
You mean general?
Yes.
In general terms.
Yes, your view about patriotism as an ideal. People who are patriotic or who define themselves as patriotic, do they tend to respect other people's rights? Are they tolerant of other cultures?
Or maybe the opposite of what you have said could be part of the dangers which patriotism entails.
Right. So patriotism may lead some people to fanaticism and chauvinism. True? Or at least some conceptions of patriotism may be more open to such criticisms of being closer to fanaticism and chauvinism.
I think it depends a lot on the historical context also. If you compare like Germany during the World War, for Hitler it would be very different nationalism, or you can compare it to Italy. I think it would be very different, but compare it to countries of the third world like India, who struggled for with the colonial world to get national freedom, or South Africa. I think it depends a lot on the historical context, and how you look at it also depends on your own subjective location of it.
Right, very true. But does Nussbaum take into account this sensitivity to context in this passage? This nuance that you have so nicely added to all this. Is this something that comes up in the passage?
I don't think so.
No, yeah, you're
don't
right.
think so,
you're
because
right.
she although this ideals, what she's talking about, justice, equality, yes, but I think they're more dependent on the historical context. You can achieve it after a context like countries of like America or Asia, the European can achieve it, okay, to a larger extent, but countries of the third world are still struggling with those ideas. Not that they didn't want to achieve it as an ideal, yes, they are the ideals we want to achieve too, but I think they struggle to achieve it, and there is no I think that it's quite subjective. I would say it's nothing as pure justice or pure equality also. It's quite depends upon the own historical context too.
And what do you think about this quotation? Do you think Nussbaum does justice to the notion of patriotism? More generally, do you think she takes into account any possible counter-arguments to the priority of cosmopolitanism over patriotism? No, at least not in this passage. True? Okay. Does this passage, does this third quotation help you see the second quotation in a different light now? Does it make things clearer about Nussbaum's position when it comes to Rorty's defense of and promotion of national pride? How does this third quotation shed light on the point Nussbaum makes about Rorty?
When I was reading the second quotation and trying to read between the lines, I was wondering whether the tone was sarcastic. And then I was thinking maybe it's just me, because I would use rejoice in quotations in a sarcastic way. I had this feeling, but I wasn't sure. But then reading quotation number 3 for me verifies that she's sarcastic, maybe a bit cynical, but I think she's being sarcastic in quotation number 2.
Right. Yes, I agree. And you see how Rorty comes up from this as an opponent, as a dialogical opponent. So now you can reconstruct in your own mind, a debate, a dialogue between Nussbaum and Rorty, where Rorty defends patriotism, a kind of patriotism anyway, and argues in favor of a political emotion such as national pride. And on the other side, Martha Nussbaum objects to this emphasis on patriotism, and she opts for cosmopolitanism, feeling that cosmopolitanism can cover the ground, the moral ground that patriotism covers, and in a safer way, without all those risks that confront patriots or patriotism of sliding into undesirable political ideals or political tendencies. Okay, so you also see in the second quotation how Nussbaum herself summarizes Rorty's position. And in the summary that she gives us of Rorty's position, Rorty appears as a rather unprotected figure, I would say, in the sense that we could very well accuse him of nationalism, based on what Nussbaum tells us about Rorty. Do you feel like that? Do you want to have a look at the second quotation again, just to verify this? I mean, whether it is it's a feeling that is conveyed by this quotation. In other words, could what is said by Rorty be said by any nationalist? Is there any protection there from any demarcation, anything that separates Rorty's position from that of a fanatic, say, or a nationalist? I think not. What do you think about that? And you, Paul, what do you think?
Well, it could be expressed by a nationalist.
Yeah, couldn't it? I think it could be expressed by nationalists. Now, is that really, was that really Rorty's position, though? Shall we go to the next quotation to see whether things are like that? Of course, you understand that extracting passages from a whole text makes things a bit difficult because they are disconnected from the rest of the text. But I suppose these passages are quite indicative of of what Rorty, for instance, was trying to do. That's why I've selected this passage, because I think it comes from the book Achieving Our Country, and I think it indicates quite well what Rorty was talking about. So would you like to have a look at it a bit? Would you like to read it a bit? Would you like to work again cooperatively on that? A couple of minutes to discuss it as a group, as groups? Are you happy with that? Okay. 2 or 3 minutes to discuss the fourth quotation. Okay. So who would like to kick off now? Who would like to raise any points or make a comment on this particular quotation? Any remarks? Yeah.
I just want to make one comment about the first line in what he says, national pride to countries where what self-respect to individuals. I think it marks already a bit of identity, of what might be identity for the US, because for what I understand, they're a culture that's based more individual in the American dreams, in which the individuals can succeed and pursue, richness, whatever they want. In comparison with some cultures that's based on the communities and based on the collective. So I think when he detached this word individuals, for me it's already showing a bit with this American energy.
Sorry, I missed you.
Which when he's detached this word individuals, for me it already shows a bit what this American identity could be also.
So you think that Rorty's position here is nationalistic, maybe, or in danger of sliding into nationalism? First of all, do you think that Rorty's position is exactly as Nussbaum has formulated it in the second quotation? I think you could do this later on. Compare the two quotations and try to see whether there is an exact match there or not, because you may find there a divergence. Maybe Rorty's position is somewhat more complicated than it seems if one relies on the second quotation, the way, Nussbaum has rendered Rorty's position. So I think it would be also for dialogical purposes, in order to be more able to see how that dialogue operated, it would be helpful, I believe, to compare the two quotations and see whether the quotation that comes from Rorty's Achieving Our Country differs, and to what extent from Nussbaum's account of it. So we'll leave this for later, okay? Because as we are running out of time, we are running short of time, I think we should move to quotations that come from Nussbaum's later work. In Political Emotions, we read, "Shared grief has a uniting, even healing power. Songs of national pride and aspiration have a similar capacity to forge or reforge a national identity." And another quotation is, "National pride is most appropriately expressed by emphasizing the unfinished work that lies before the nation." So how would you respond? How would you respond to these quotations now?
Seems very different from her previous position.
Yes, yeah, doesn't it? This is very different from her previous position. It's a major shift, isn't it? And this is not an outcome of the fact that the quotations are disconnected. Indeed, in most of her recent writings on political emotions, emotions related to the state, to the country, there we find that she defends what she calls globally sensitive patriotism. And she now discards cosmopolitanism. In what way? She no longer thinks that cosmopolitanism is her favorite ethical view. She believes that the ground of cosmopolitanism can be covered by a globally sensitive patriotism. So it's a reversal of the previous position. Her previous position was that patriotism is a moral view that could be replaced by cosmopolitanism. Now she turns the tables on the cosmopolitans and argues that because a patriotism that is sensitive to constraints, global constraints of justice, can operate much better as an ethical view. And the reasons she gives, well, she gives many reasons, but one of the reasons she gives is that people tend to love what is near and dear, what is close to them. So she believes that we have to cultivate this emotion of love for those who are near us. And that the best way to develop conscious citizens, critical citizens, is by building on that emotion, the love for country. So that's her new position now. One of the reasons she gives why the old cosmopolitanism that she endorsed should be discarded is that she feels that it was cold and uninspiring, that it was too abstract, and that if we want a better moral view, we can develop that better moral view through cultivating a critical patriotism, as she terms it. So that's her new position. And the last quotation explains it a little bit more. The name-watery motivation comes from Aristotle's criticism of Plato's ideal city. Plato tried to remove partiality by removing family ties and asking all citizens to care equally for all other citizens. Aristotle says that the difficulty with this strategy is that there are two things above all that make people love and care for something: the thought that it is all theirs and the thought that it is the only one they have. Neither of these will be present in that city. If you would like to compare this with cosmopolitanism, you can replace equally for all other citizens with to care equally for all other human beings. If you make this substitution there, you will see that the cosmopolitan's position would be more or less something like Plato's position, but projected to the whole world, not just to the city. And Nussbaum objects to that. So, Aristotle says that Plato's ideal city wants to remove family ties. Nussbaum identifies with Aristotle here and says cosmopolitanism wants to remove patriotic ties. In both cases, we have something that is motivationally insufficient. Because in her own view, and in Aristotle's view, as she understands him, the difficulty with all this is that people love and care for something which is theirs. That they feel it's their own. And the thought that it is the only one they have. And neither of these will be present in that city. If we follow up this projection that we operated a minute ago, it's like, nothing of all this, nothing of this love and care will be present in an abstract ideal of cosmopolitanism, because you just cannot love everybody. Okay? Now, it's a pity we cannot unfold all this a little bit more and at a deeper level, but my objection here, let me just formulate two objections here to Nussbaum's account. My first objection is that she doesn't read Aristotle correctly in a linguistic sense, because she uses a translation that does not render properly the last bit of Aristotle's argument. It is true that Aristotle says that people love and care for something which is theirs, and Aristotle uses the word idion, one's own. But the second part of the sentence, the thought that it is the only one they have, this indicates a kind of exclusive possession, correct? Well, that's not there in Aristotle, because the word Aristotle uses is agapiton, which means dear, lovable, delightful, worthy of love. That phrase, that term, and the phrase we may use to translate it, does not have to do with possession. And I believe that takes me to my second objection to Nussbaum's position. I believe that this is important because instead of assuming that all is about possession, something is mine and it's the only one I have, instead of assuming this, we may give to love and care a different meaning, one that has to do with loving what is worthy of love, or what can be made worthy of love through our own efforts. So in that way, perhaps, we can direct an ideal of patriotism, or at least our conception of an ideal of patriotism toward creating a better country and trying to make our country better, instead of loving what it is already, our country, in a static kind of way. I remember that as soon as I walked in, you were talking about the static element and the more mobile and more active and dynamic sense of logos. So I don't know if it makes a good sense here to connect this distinction with the dynamic and the static. When you love what your country is because it is yours, it's like loving something that you interpret in static terms and in a sort of private sense of something that belongs to you in possessive and private terms. Whereas if you give a dynamic dimension to all this, you may love something that is not yet there, that should be an outcome of a collective effort, guided by principles, emotions, but also by a broader sense of an ethic that is more sensitive to the other, the responsibilities to the other. So a kind of more outward looking optics of patriotism in relation to the other people and the other countries that are entangled in relations with our own country. So I will stop here. I think we should stop here, no?
Can I say something about what you just said? I don't know how this works in the languages that you speak, but in English you can make a distinction between taking a pride in what you've done and taking a pride in your work. So if I say I'm proud of what I've done, then it puts the emphasis on me. Look at me, look at what I've achieved. Whereas if I take a pride in my work, the emphasis is on the work itself. So whatever work I do, whether I make tables or teach or write essays or whatever, I'm trying to make them as good as they can be. It's not about me, it's about them. I don't know if you can translate that, if that works in your own languages. You see how that works? But it's quite a significant thing, because one's self-congratulatory and the other one is outward focus on the goodness of the thing. So possibly that could be related to the future-oriented pride that you were referring to in one's country, as opposed to being proud because your country's done this or done that, and isn't it big, isn't it important?
Yeah, it's not pride about an accomplished reality, but it's pride or hope associated with a possible future.
Yes, okay. So we were talking about our city being a city of words earlier on. So if our city is a city of words, it's something where we should take a pride in what we produce out of this. A pride in making the words we use good words that contribute to something better in the future.
Stanley Cavell's
That's his
position?
title, yes, he has the title,
the title
taken from the Republic. Yes.
Any comments or any concluding comments on your part? Any? Shall we call it a day then?
I think so. Is that all right? Everybody?
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.